Okay, I am Halivni, along with Jeffrey Reches. It's March 6th. We're in Washington, sitting with Saul Newman. He's going to be talking about his grandfather, Rabbi Louis I. Newman, his parents, Jeremy and Ann Newman, and some other family members. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Why don't we start? Generally, the first question that we'll ask in an interview is, how far back can you talk about your family, where they came from, the background, and why don't we start with that? If you can.
So I can go back quite far. I mean, this is prior to the Israel portion. I have a lot of records of my family because my children are sixth-generation Americans. So we go back quite far to the 1820s in the United States, but even before that, we can trace ourselves back on one side of the family to the 1600s in a town called Ingviller in Alsace-Lorraine. So my father's mother's side comes from there, and that goes back to the 1640s. They had a store in Ingviller, but we can trace back the branches of most of our family did not come from Poland, except for my mom's side, so we can go back pretty far. We have a lot of German, Dutch, and sort of French, Alsace-Lorraine, that traces back fairly far.
And who came to America?
So the first person to come to America in part of my extended family was a fellow named David Eckstein, who came in the 1820s from Rechendorf in Bavaria, which was a cow town. And although the family was cattle merchants, and they came to the United States, and the shul there was called the Moo Shul because everybody worked in cattle. And he came to the United States, and he eventually settled in Syracuse and became a brewer in Syracuse in the 1830s. And his brother, Mayor Eckstein, who one of my children is named after, was an advisor to General Grant. And he appears in the books on the Jews in the Civil War, and he was involved in trying to get Order Number 11 repealed by General Grant during the Civil War. And in fact, later, when General Grant ran for president, he was General Grant's sort of Jewish advisor on the campaign. He tried to convince the Jewish community of Ohio, he was living in Cincinnati at the time, to vote for General Grant, and he was rewarded by that by General Grant. He was made, for a while, the Consul General in Vancouver, and later he was made the Consul General of the United States in Amsterdam. So that's how far back we go back to the United States, but they're different, obviously different portions of the family came at different times. I mean, the most recent arrival was my mother, who was born in Germany, in Kiel, in 1927, and came in May 38 before the war.
This Eckstein was your
great-great-great-great-great-grandfather.
And then they stayed in the north?
They stayed in the north. Obviously, they were Northerners. They lived in Syracuse. They lived in Cincinnati. And eventually, they moved sort of eastward and ended up in New York, that branch of the family.
Were they traditional?
So they were traditional up until probably the 1870s, 1880s. They got swept up in the reform movement in the United States, and they married into some Orthodox members of the family who came from Europe, from France. And when they came to the United States, I actually have my great-grandfather's memoirs, and he talks about how he kept kosher in Ingviller, where he grew up, and he had his first treif meal on the boat coming across the Atlantic to the United States. And when he got to the United States, he put on tefillin but ate treif, and eventually became friendly with Stephen Wise and got involved with Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. So they became Reform around then, the early 1900s, late 1800s.
But other parts of the family, your family stayed in Europe and you had said that there were some that went to Palestine?
Right. So the first member of my family to go to Palestine was my great-great-grandfather. I have a picture of him here. His name was Yisrael Leib Newman, and same name as me. And he was born in 1813 in Wושינגטon, in what was then Austria-Hungary. And just to explain how he's related to me, if that's interesting, if that's important, he was my father's 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 father. So he was my great-great-grandfather. And he was born in 1813 in Wושינגטon, which was at that time divided into two parts. Part of it was Austria-Hungary and part of it was the Ukraine. And there was actually a bridge between the two of them. Here's a picture of the town. You can't see it very well. Here's the picture of the town in the early 1900s. There was a bridge between it. Both parts were Wושינגטon. The Austro-Hungarian side was slightly wealthier side. My great-great-grandfather was an egg merchant, and he used to raise eggs or buy eggs in Austria-Hungary and then cross the bridge, the toll bridge, over to the Ukrainian side and sell the eggs there. He lived there starting in 1813, and he was a Zionist. And at the time, the community was really dominated by the Woshinגטon Rebbe, which was a Hasidic family. Woshinגטon Rebbe's grandson eventually told everybody before the war they should make Aliyah, but the Woshinגטon Rebbe, who was alive at the time my great-great-grandfather was alive, was actually very anti-Zionist, as was often the case at that time.
What do you mean by Zionist? It was the early 1800s.
So this is the late 1800s, the 1860s, 1870s. It's after Hess is already written. You know, it's before Herzl, but after Hess.
Okay.
So there's sort of thoughts out there. It's not an organized Zionist movement, but he was kind of Zioni in his own way. I don't have any of his writings to indicate that, but the family story is that there was some tension between him and the Woshinגטon Rebbe, who was very anti-Zionist, which was starting to merge in the 1880s. I mean, you already had Bilu, right, in the early 1880s, so there was talk about Aliyah, or moving to Israel, moving to Palestine. In 1890, as this family story is told, he had had enough of the Woshinגטon Rebbe, and at that point he was 70, well, he was born in 18, so he must have been 77 years old. His wife was significantly younger, though, so she was probably in her 50s. They picked up and made Aliyah, made Aliyah to Yaffo in 1890, and they moved to Yaffo in 1890, and they lived in Yaffo for about 2 or 3 years. 3 years. In fact, I have a picture here which my father always claimed was my great-great-grandfather, but it's in fact my great-grandfather and his wife, who actually, this picture was taken in Yaffo. They went to Yaffo to visit his parents, and when you got off the boat, there must have been some sort of Arab merchant or something who dressed you up in costume and took a picture of you. So this is the picture of them in 1891 in Yaffo. They were there 3 years. He was already quite elderly. Both of them contracted pneumonia, as far as we know, and they both died in 1893 in Yaffo. They're actually buried in the old cemetery in Yaffo, in the Arab neighborhood of Yaffo. I don't know if you've ever been there. There's a cemetery that has a gate, a wall around it, and you have to go to the Chevra Kadisha in Tel Aviv and get a key to the cemetery. But then they say to you have to get it on Tuesday or Wednesday because you have to return it before Shabbat. But you get the key, and then you're allowed to go into the cemetery. And I actually was there a couple of years ago. My father, many years ago, drew a diagram of the cemetery and where the graves are. And I actually went there a couple of years ago, and their graves are there. They died in 1893. And their graves, stones are kind of rubbed out. I have to fix them up, but they're there. So they were the first people who made Aliyah. But their children, they had 5 children, none of their children made Aliyah. They made Aliyah from Woshinגטon after most of their children had already left Europe. And my great-grandfather, who's in this picture, who came to visit them in Yaffo, actually had left years before from Woshinגטon and lived in Providence, Rhode Island.
So did he come directly to Providence from Europe?
He came from Woshinגטon directly to Providence, and he settled in Providence, and he went to visit his parents when the parents were in Palestine, but Providence offered him more opportunity in the 1890s than Yaffo did, so he never stayed. He went to visit and then came back to the States. And then his parents died, so that was the end of sort of the lineage in Palestine in 1893.
What was your great-grandfather's name?
My great-grandfather's name was Paul Newman, Pinchas Newman, the first Paul Newman.
Okay. Okay, so Paul Newman is now living in Providence,
Rhode Island, and he's a businessman in Providence, and he has 2 children. He has a daughter and a son. The son was my grandfather, Rabbi Louis I. Newman, who was born in 1893 in Providence. I can give you a sort of brief synopsis of his life and then talk about sort of the relevant parts. And by the way, I should mention, by the way, just as an aside, that both my grandfather and my great-grandfather have pages in David Tidhar's book, which I'm sure you know about, David Tidhar's 19-volume, tome on the founders of the State of Israel. And in fact, this picture appears in that book.
So which ones who has the entries in the...
So Yisrael Leib Newman, my great-great-grandfather, and Rabbi Louis I. Newman, my grandfather. Okay, so Rabbi Louis I. Newman was born in 1893 in Providence, as I said. He grew up in Providence. He went to Brown University.
Was the family traditional?
Reformish. I mean, my grandfather, since his father had come from Europe, my grandfather's name growing up was Label. So he sort of had the Yiddishisms, and it was sort of, I would say they weren't reform in the sense of, officially reform, but I think they were sort of, they had Friday night dinner, as far as I know, and things like that, but I don't think they kept, as far as I know, they didn't keep kosher and didn't really keep Shabbat. So he was born there, he was raised there, he went to Brown University, he graduated Brown when he was 20. At that point,
were there quotas at Brown in those days?
There were quotas at Brown at those days, but they also took people who were from Providence, so it was helpful. And he was valedictorian of his class, and actually years later he came back to Brown and gave the commencement address at Brown. And my father went to Brown as well, so there was this tradition. He graduated in 1913. He actually was accepted to Harvard Law School, but turned it down, where there were quotas too, I assume, at the time. And instead he decided to study for the rabbinate and Semitics. He moved out to Berkeley, which was sort of an unusual thing to do at the time, and he studied Semitics out there and wrote his master's thesis on biblical parallelism in Berkeley. He then came back to New York, and he became a pupil of Stephen Wise. And he studied with Stephen Wise in New York for a number of years, he never went to a formal program, he never went to HUC or anything like that, but he was given a reform ordination by Stephen Wise. And he lived there, he worked in a small synagogue temple there in the city, and then he went to Columbia University, and he wrote his PhD at Columbia on Jewish influence on Christian reform movements. It's a study of Jewish influence on Calvin and Zwingli and Martin Luther and people like that. It's still published by Cambridge University Press. You can still get copies, although it's not in print anymore. In 1924, he was offered the job of the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. And he moved out back to the West Coast, back to San Francisco. Temple Emmanuel still stands in he was the rabbi that built the temple, actually. It's what's known as the Lake Street Temple in San Francisco. It's an enormous temple. He built it in 1925 it was built. And he had his 3 sons out there in San Francisco. In 1930, he was offered the position of rabbi of Temple Road of Shalom on Central Park West at 7 West 83rd, which is the second biggest Reform temple in the world. So he took that job and moved back to New York in 1930.
When did he get married?
He got married let me just do the math here, in 1921. He married, 22, he was 28 years old at the time, and he married his Sunday school student who was then 18, Lucille Uri, and she actually, just as an aside, she's a Uri related to the Uri family. I don't know if you know the Uri. One of the Uris wrote Driving Miss Daisy, Alfred Uri, and whatever. Anyway, so they got married in 1921. She actually moved out to California in 1924 with him, and she became the Rebbitzin of the largest synagogue on the West Coast at age 20, which must have been a pretty daunting experience. And they had their 3 children out there. I have lots of pictures I can show you later. In 1930, they moved back to New York, and he became involved and became the rabbi of Rodef Shalom. He was always very Zionistic. By the 1920s, the big change that occurs, not a change, but he becomes the first Reform rabbi in the world who's a revisionist and a supporter of Jabotinsky and a friend of Jabotinsky. And he uses his synagogue as a base for Jabotinsky when Jabotinsky comes to the States. I don't have the letters here, they're all at Hebrew Union College now, but Jabotinsky used to use my grandfather's office as his mailing address. So letters would be addressed to Vladimir Jabotinsky, care of Rabbi Louis I. Newman, Temple of Odot Shalom. My father used to have member stories of Jabotinsky coming for dinner at my grandfather's house on Central Park West, 271 Central Park West. In addition to that, there are some apocryphal stories that I have not been able to confirm. He certainly raised money for the Irgun and the revisionists. There are some apocryphal stories that he stored weapons in his rather massive library in Rodef Shalom to be shipped to the Irgun, but I have no independent confirmation of that. I've seen it in scholarly works being written, but I'm skeptical that he actually did that. There was a lot of pushback at the time.
Well, how did it come about that he became, that was an unpopular opinion?
Yes, it was very unpopular, and he fought tremendously. In fact, he fell out with Stephen Wise over this issue, and he fell out with the entire Reform Jewish community over this issue.
What made him do it?
He was a very angry man. I mean, I think he was, somebody who didn't, go with the flow. He stood up for what he believed in. I think he was also he was not religious at all, but he was very intensely culturally Jewish. And he felt very strongly that the connection to the land was incredibly important, and that the future of the Jewish people, maybe because one of the things, for example, that he was very opposed to was he was one of the only Reform rabbis at the time who refused to do intermarriages, and he actually published 27 books. One of the books he published was a book called Jewish People, Faith and Life, in which he had it was a sort of a guide for people who wanted to do Reform conversions, and it was very strict by Reform standards as to what the expectation was. I would just mention on the side that he was also very unusual for a Reform rabbi in that he was a scholarly expert on Hasidus. And the most famous book he ever wrote was a book called Hasidic Anthology, which is a several hundred-page book that's a collection of Hasidic stories that is still being used today by people, which is very unusual for a Reform rabbi. So he had a lot of eclectic interests. So all this sort of coalesced around his being a revisionist. He fought a lot with a lot of Reform rabbis. He fought with Judah Magnus. I can talk about that later also as well.
How did he meet Jabotinsky initially? Do you have any idea?
I don't know the backstory. I think that he was a prominent rabbi who held these positions in a very wealthy pulpit. And I think if I were Jabotinsky, I would have a strong vested interest in knowing this man, because this man could raise money for my cause on a dime. I mean, there's a story I can get to later, I may be appropriate now. There was a boat called the Sicario, which was a boat that was hired by the revisionists, which in 1939 was stuck in the Danube right before the doors of Europe closed, and the Bergson Group and others were trying to raise money to get the boat to Palestine. And a lot of the leading donors and wealthy people in the United States, including Stephen Wise, didn't want to raise money for the boat. And he raised $30,000 in one night to get the boat to Palestine because nobody else could raise the money. So I think he was a useful person to know. He was also very not prescient, he didn't have to be prescient, but unlike most other Reform rabbis and other leaders in the United States, he spoke up very early against Hitler. If you look at the New York Times, which has, in those days, used to publish they don't do it anymore, but they used to publish the sermons of leading rabbis and leading priests and ministers in New York in the Sunday edition of the paper. By 1928, he was already making speeches at Rosh Hashanah against Hitler, and he was sort of well ahead of the curve on that. And certainly starting in 1933, he was very aggressively involved. And I think what sealed the deal for him in the 1930s was he saw what was coming, and he wanted to get as many Jews out of Europe as possible. So he was involved. He did this for many years. His synagogue eventually got upset. The temple eventually got lay leadership got upset about this. It was publicity they didn't want, so they basically said to him, either you stop meeting Jabotinsky in the synagogue, or stop meeting with Jabotinsky, or we're going to fire you. And of course, this was a very prestigious pulpit that he had always wanted. So he actually used to meet with Jabotinsky on a park bench on Central Park West on 83rd Street. The park bench is still there. I don't know if they've redone it since then, and they used to have their meetings there because that wasn't meeting in the synagogue. So he didn't change his position, he just didn't meet with them in the synagogue. And later he met with Begin. I don't have the documents with me, and I didn't bring it. I have a book, autographed by Begin to my grandfather, and there are letters at HUC between the correspondence between Begin and my grandfather. My grandfather was also very involved in he broke away from the Zionist Organization of America, and he helped form the New Zionist Organization and American Friends of a Jewish Palestine, which were revisionist not front organizations, but revisionist organizations, and he led both of those for a number of years. He also was very involved in working with Zionist leaders in the United States to try to get them to move away from the he didn't like the Histadrut, move away from labor Zionism to more right-wing Zionism. I have some correspondence at home, which I didn't bring with me, between him and Einstein. He used to go every year or 6 months or so to meet with Einstein to try to get, in Princeton, to try to get Einstein, and Einstein eventually did, to turn against Judah Magnus. My grandfather knew Judah Magnus very well in San Francisco. Magnus was the head of Hebrew U at the time, and of course Magnus was preaching a Zionism that my grandfather was not comfortable with, and Einstein was very involved in Hebrew U, and of course Einstein eventually came out against Judah Magnus. I would like to think partially as a result of my grandfather's influence.
When that happened with where the shul came to him and said that they...
It was soon afterwards. I think it was like 1931, 32. I think it was pretty early in the process. He also, I have some letters at home and I didn't bring them. He was also, we have documents of him advocating for the Irgun. So there's, for example, I have at home, he actually, because he was fairly well connected and traveled in American elites, his tennis partner in college in the 1930s was the Assistant Secretary of State, which was pretty unusual for a Jew to have those sorts of connections. So I have a telegram at home. In 1938, there was a fellow named Shlomo Ben Yosef, who was a member of the Irgun, who was executed by the British for bombing a bus in Sfat outside of Sfat that had Arabs in it in retaliation for an Arab attack on a Jewish bus in Sfat around a few weeks before. And I have a telegram in which my grandfather wrote to Cordell Hull, who was then not a secretary of the Jews, basically write to him as Secretary of State, asking him to intervene to stop the British from executing Shlomo Ben Yosef. And I actually have at home, I didn't bring it, but it's fascinating, I have a response telegram from Cordell Hull to my grandfather that was written 2 minutes after Shlomo Ben Yosef was supposed to be executed, basically saying, there's nothing I can do about it now, we don't intervene in British policy, his scheduled execution was time X and it's now X plus 2. So, he tried, but he didn't always succeed. I'm sorry, you want to ask questions? I'm sorry.
You can go ahead. We're in the 1930s.
Right. So, in the 1940s, he raised money. He continued to raise money for the Irgun through the war.
In 1938, if I'm not mistaken, was when the first iteration of what became the Bergson Group
Right.
Started.
Right.
And was there a connection immediately?
Right. So the most immediate connection to the Bergson Group, my grandfather was never a member of the Bergson Group. The most immediate connection to the Bergson Group is, as you know, Yitzchak Ben Ami was very involved in the Bergson Group. Yitzchak Ben Ami was a member of my grandfather's temple. So they actually had a very close relationship, and my grandfather worked with Yitzchak Ben Ami. Ironically enough, I believe you've interviewed Jeremy Ben Ami. Jerry Ben Ami's father-in-law, Ephraim Biran, became the cantor at Rodef Shalom, my grandfather's synagogue, a number of years later, and was the cantor when my grandfather died, and is still alive and lives here in Washington. But so he supported the Bergson Group. He was involved in, helping recruit Marlon Brando and people like that, because he had these sorts of connections to work with the Bergson Group, but he was not a member of the Bergson Group.
But it was his connections because of his prominence that was the entree to some of these...
Right. I mean, I have letters at home. We keep at home sort of the personal letters of my grandfather. And my grandfather was very connected to sort of literary figures. He was friendly with Thornton Wilder, and he was friendly with a number of other people. So I don't have letters specifically about Marlon Brando and that sort of issue, but he was definitely friendly with Ben Hecht. So he was definitely involved in that sort of he was always very interested in theater. He wrote his own operas and his own cantatas, and in fact, he was very involved in the 1960s. This is a side point. Joseph Papp used to do Shakespeare in the Park, and in the 1960s, Joseph Papp, who was then a young director, wanted to do The Merchant of Venice in Central Park, and my grandfather was very involved in organizing a boycott and a protest to try to get him from doing The Merchant of Venice. He felt it was anti-Semitic. So he had a lot of literary and artistic friends, although he maybe lost some of them through the years, but so he had those connections, but like I said, he was not, by that time, the temple had become very large. He spent a lot of time on that. He raised money, he went to rallies, but he was not a day-to-day connection to the Bergson Group, other than his helping Yitzchak Ben Ami.
Okay. In 1940, Jabotinsky's in New York, and he passes away in New York.
Right, upstate, I believe, though, not in the city, right.
Right. Was there any connection or...
So I don't think he had, I don't know, I have no documentation about this, so I don't know if he was involved in sort of getting the body, flown back. I have no idea about that. I really have no records of that. I do know that he became friendly with Begin around that time and sort of transferred his allegiance to Menachem Begin, but I don't have it. I personally don't have documents on that. There may be documents at Hebrew Union College about that, because all my grandfather's documents were sent there, but I haven't gone through them yet to really know that. So, I mean, by the 1940s, he becomes, I think that after, the state is formed, I think he always, after Alta Atlantis and all those issues, occur, I think my grandfather becomes a supporter of the state, and he always supported Begin, was always friendly with Begin, but I don't think he sort of got involved as much on a day-to-day basis. He'd raise money, he'd always go to events in New York.
Before that,
yeah.
We're now in the 40s, was with the Shoah.
Right.
How did that impact, or how did, do you know, have letters or sermons or
right.
From that?
We have lots of sermons in which he spoke very vociferously about the Shoah, tried to rescue Jews. He had a second break with Stephen Wise about this. He felt Stephen Wise was not being aggressive enough in sort of demanding bombing of the railway lines and things like that. My grandfather knew Truman, he knew Eleanor Roosevelt, but he was kind of, I would say, a step removed from them. Stephen Wise was really the spokesperson for the American Jewish community that had the direct link to FDR. So everything had to happen through Stephen Wise. I don't think my grandfather had a personal relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. So as a result, he was the whole world was dependent on Stephen Wise. And I think that, Stephen Wise did what he thought was the best he could do, but I think my grandfather was increasingly frustrated. They later had a rapprochement, but I think that were difficult times because my grandfather was constantly giving sermons about it. And then at the end of the war, he was constantly giving sermons. My grandfather hated the British, and he was very, very frustrated with the British colonial office and how they dealt with Jewish immigration to Palestine at the end of the war. There are documents that Rafi Medoff found, which I have not seen, in which the consul general in New York the British consul general had written to the Foreign Office in Britain about my grandfather, saying that my grandfather was probably not a spy, but was at the very least a tremendously misguided man, and we need to keep an eye on him. So my grandfather spent at the end of the war, my grandfather spent several years sort of trying to organize to break the white paper and try to get more Jews into Palestine, and railed against the British from the pulpit, which was not a sort of dumb thing. And the New York Times has all his speeches about that.
Do you know if they were actively trying to raise money to support Aryeh?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't have the documents as to how much or when, but he definitely was involved. There's no question involved, and I've seen references to that, yes.
Abba Hillel Silver?
A good friend of his, right. So he was friendly with all the Reform rabbis at the time.
Probably more on his...
Right, closer to what he felt, right. So he became closer to people like that. He also, over time, became closer to a lot of Orthodox rabbis who he felt understood, like Israel Goldstein and Rabbi Lookstein's father and people like that, who he felt were sort of closer to his sort of belief system. And of course, the issue, I think, that made the connection between me and you initially was that he was the representative of the Central Conference of American Rabbis at the UN when the partition plan was debated and voted upon. And one of the sort of famous documents that he wrote was after the partition plan was voted on, he wrote, I think it was a 13-page letter to my father and my father's brothers describing what happened at the partition plan negotiations and vote, and that letter is now in Hebrew Union College, and Hebrew Union College has republished it recently as a teaching tool for students to learn about the partition plan negotiations.
I want to talk more about the letter in a minute, but first I wanted to ask, in July of 1945, Ben-Gurion comes to New York, and he asks Henry Monter from the UJA to put together a group of people to meet at Rudolf Sonnenborn's house. Sonnenborn, and becomes what's called the Sonnenborn Institute. Does anything like that, do you know of any?
So I'm sorry, I don't have the documents. I've never heard that as a family story. I know that happened. I don't really know anything about that time period and whether my grandfather was involved in that. My grandfather had he was frying a lot of other fish at the time. He was having a big fight with the Jewish Institute of Religion and HUC, and there was a whole bunch of reform politics that was going on as well, which I'm more familiar with. I'm not familiar as whether he was involved in that.
Okay. Let's talk about the letter from...
right, which I have here, I believe. I brought a copy with me. I think I have a copy. Here it is. UN partition decision of November 29th, 1947. The letter is dated December 2nd, 1947. Do you have a question, or do you want me to talk about the letter?
Why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Right. So my grandfather was a tremendous writer. I mean, he wrote, those days people wrote letters. So he wrote books. He wrote 27 books, but he also wrote a large number of letters. So he was at the partition plan negotiations in November 1947, representing the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He was an observer, but my grandfather didn't observe anything. He was always very involved in what happened. So he wrote this letter on December 2nd, 1947, to my father and his two brothers, who were then all in college, sort of telling them what happened at the negotiations. And he describes in tremendous detail about what different speakers and delegates said, what he thought of what they said. He also talks a lot, because he was still a Reform rabbi, he talks a lot about how, I heard this speaker, and then I had to rush to do a funeral in Long Island, and then I had to rush back to Temple to give a sermon, and then I rushed back to what was then Queens, to Flushing, to the negotiations.
So it wasn't just the actual vote, it was the days leading up to...
Right, all the debate and sort of... Right, and he talks in the letter about his interactions with Nachum Goldman and Andrei Gromyko, who later became the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and his sort of conversations and his attempts to sort of sway them. And he said that, he mentions in the letter that he had more sway with some people than others, because at the time the delegation from these sort of Jewish delegations were all dominated mostly by people from sort of the Sachnut and the Jewish Agency, from Labor and from Mapai, and he says in the letter that they kind of looked at him as a revisionist spy, but nonetheless he was there and he describes the events that happened.
Okay, now he's writing this to your father and his brothers.
Right. My father was at Brown at the time. I had another uncle who was at Yale at the time, and my third uncle was at Bard. They were all in college.
Who's the oldest?
My father was the oldest. He had actually, I take it back. My father had graduated Brown. I apologize. My father had graduated Brown by then. My father was actually at Hebrew Union College studying to be a Reform rabbi at the time.
Okay. So now we're at the end of 1947, and any other pieces from around that time, from basically, once after this happens is the beginnings of in the lead up to the War of Independence.
Right. So I've seen documents referring to his arranging for arms shipments, but I don't have those documents with me. They were all at Hebrew Union College, so I can't recall them from memory. I'd have to go back to Hebrew Union College.
What do you mean by arms shipments? What kind of, that from the synagogue, that from...
So probably not from the synagogue. It was probably largely raising money for shipments. So I don't know. I don't think he ever held the weapons or possessed them, but I think he was very active. My understanding is he was very active in raising from his temple money to ship weapons. What those weapons were, whether they were rifles or airplanes, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
The founding of the state in May. Anything that he... So
I do know that there was a big event. There were events celebrating in the United States, like in Madison Square Garden, and other events, and he attended those. But he only, as far as I can tell, he only went to Israel once, and that was in the 1960s. So he never went to Israel for any of this. His son did, which was my father, which is sort of the next stage of the story.
Okay. There were a number of pageants and plays that were put on at Madison Square Garden. There was We Shall Never Die.
Right, he was at all of those. I have some pictures, not here with me, of him at several of those. He may have been involved in raising money for them, I don't know, but he was definitely at them. In addition to, I have pictures of him, at anti-Hitler rallies in the 1930s and things like that too.
The Altalena?
I have no documents whatsoever, I'm sorry, that refer directly to that. So I know what it is, but I don't have any documents tying him to that whatsoever.
Jeremy told me that his father was actually the one who paid for the Altalena and then was on the Altalena.
Right. So I'm guessing, based on that my grandfather might have helped raise money for it, because he worked very closely with Yitzhak Ben Ami, but like I said, I don't have any documents that I have in my possession that I can show that say that. That would, if they exist, they would be at HUC, and I haven't been there yet to look it up.
Were any of the other Berkson people, like Hillel Cook, or involved in Rosh Shalom, or
no,
just Yitzhak Ben Ami?
Just Yitzhak Ben Ami.
Okay.
And by the way, in a number of years ago, Jeremy may have mentioned this, the Rafi Medoff and the Wyman Institute did an event at Rosh Shalom in memory of Yitzhak Ben Ami and my grandfather.
All right, now we are, I don't know if you want to continue with your
I think my grandfather over time became increasingly establishment, right? So he always held revisionist views. He was always a supporter of Ben Gurion, but I think Begin. But I think by the late 1940s or 1950s, he's a well-established Reform rabbi in a large temple that's growing, and I think his angry activism dissipates, and he just becomes a general supporter of Israel. When he dies in 1972. He's approached by Beitar, his family is approached by Beitar, and they build a dormitory and classroom at Kfar Raziel in memory of my grandfather. So I have memories in the early 1970s of going to Mitsudat Zev and meeting with the bureaucrats there, and we funded this building, which still exists in Kfar Raziel. I've only been there once.
And he stayed. He remained the rabbi of all the way up until his death.
Until his death in March 1972. There's quite a long obituary in the New York Times about him, which mentions his connections to Zionism.
And when were you born?
I was born in November of '61. So I knew my grandfather fairly well. We used to go every Sunday to visit him in Central Park West, and I knew him fairly well. And I have audio, I don't have it here, I have it on my computer, but I have audio tapes of him giving sermons and things like that.
Anything about 1967? How that might have, any recollection?
So I know he was sent money, but I don't have any strong recollections of what else he did in 1967. I know he spoke from the pulpit, but beyond that, I don't know. He also was very involved in sort of non-Israel related things. So for example, when JFK died, he actually wrote a poem in memory of JFK that became the poem that was issued with the commemorative stamp in memory of JFK. So the year afterwards, on JFK's birthday, the United States government issued a commemorative stamp, and if you bought the commemorative stamp on the first day, it came with a poem from my grandfather called The Riderless Horse. So my grandfather was involved in lots of other things that necessarily, later in his life, that weren't necessarily Israel related.
Wow. Okay. Now, your father.
My father. So my father went to Brown, and
he was born what year?
He was born in 1925 in San Francisco, and my grandparents lived in San Francisco. He went to Brown as well. At Brown, he studied biblical literature to be a Reform rabbi. He studied with Bill Browder in Brown, and I'm not sure he wanted to be a Reform rabbi, but his father wanted him to be a Reform rabbi because he was the eldest in the family. I think it bothered him because he was studying to be a Reform rabbi, and he was studying biblical literature, he got a deferment, which was during the war, which was very painful for him, I think, in retrospect, because all of his classmates at Brown were going overseas to fight, and my father was at Brown and doing this because he was studying to be a chaplain, so to speak. He didn't have to serve. After the war, he went to, after he graduated Brown, he went to Hebrew Union College, I think largely because my grandfather wanted his eldest son to be a rabbi, and I think he had a very difficult time there. I think he had a difficult time at two levels. I think he felt very, very guilty that he had not served in the war, especially in 1945 when he found out what had happened in the Holocaust and the full extent of it. I think it was very traumatic for him. I know it was very traumatic for him. He also found Reform Judaism to be kind of hypocritical. How can you be a good Jew and a good Zionist and not keep kosher and not keep halacha? So he actually dropped out of Hebrew Union College after a couple of years, much to the chagrin of my grandfather, and they had a falling out. And he actually moved. At the time, as you probably know, there were a series of kibbutzim in New Jersey, Hachshara, through Shomer Hadati, that was training people to make Aliyah. So he actually left, a pretty comfortable life on Central Park West and ended up moving into this sort of kibbutz, Hachshara. I have some pictures here, in New Jersey in 1947.
How did he get involved or aware of Shomer Hadati?
So I think he moved back to New York briefly, and I think there he sort of connected with members of Shomer Dati. I don't know exactly how. And he ended up moving to this kibbutz because he wanted to make Aliyah, and he became in charge of milking the cows on this kibbutz. It was...
Which the kibbutz?
I was always referred to by my parents as Hachshara.
Okay.
That was always what I was referred to. He moved there in 1947. I have some pictures here I can show you later of the kibbutz. And while he was there, he was in charge of milking the cows. And my mother, who had been born in Germany and came to the United States in 1938, family had moved to the Bronx, and they had been very involved in the Shomer Dati. And my mom, growing up in the Bronx, that was her sort of youth group. So she had a friend who was on the kibbutz in 1947 and 48, and this friend invited my mother to come to the kibbutz for Shabbat, and she met my father. My father was kind of unusual for somebody who was on a kibbutz in 1947-48. He was 6'3.5", Brown University educated, grew up on Central Park West, very striking looking guy. It was a little bit unusual. So she came there, and she was a greener, right? She had come from Europe in 1938. I assume she had gone to college, but I assume she probably still had a bit of a German or Yiddish accent at the time, although she eventually lost it. And I think she was sort of smitten with him. And they met there, and they decided to get married. I think it was a bit of a traumatic experience when she first met my grandfather, because not only he was a Reform rabbi, but he lived in 271 Central Park West. I remember when my grandfather died, the people who paid Shiva calls were the people in the building, which included Shelley Winters, Joel Gray, Marlo Thomas, James Caan. It was just a different world. I would have wanted to be a fly on the wall when my grandparents on my mother's side first met my grandparents on my father's side. But they got married, and they moved. They were the first. I have pictures of them coming back to Hachshara after they got married. They were the first married couple on this kibbutz. And Aharon Greenberg, I don't know if you know him, who's Yitz Greenberg's brother, was on the kibbutz at the same time. And he told me this story, I'd never heard it before, that since they were the first married couple, and they used to have separate quarters for the men and the women, they had to have a special me'asef to decide where my parents would be allowed to live. And they decided they were going to build a wall in the chicken coop at the kibbutz, and my parents would live on the other side of the chicken coop. My mom would say, the first week she was married, she'd wake up in the morning and be covered in chicken feathers. So they lived there, and they decided to make Aliyah. And
was it Livingston Manor? Was that where they were?
It was in Cranberry. Cranberry. I think there was one in Livingston Manor as well. Theirs was in Cranberry. And they decided to make Aliyah in 1949. I think my grandfather, by then, was sort of mad at my dad that he became frum, but was sort of very thrilled that his child was actually making Aliyah, because he was never going to make Aliyah. So they decided they were going to move. The ideal plan, the long-term plan, was they were going to move to Kfar Darom, which was then a place for Shomer Dati people to move, and a lot of their friends did end up moving to Kfar Darom. They left in 1949. I have pictures here in the album of them, at the dock, getting on the boat. They went on a boat called the Neptunia, which my father used to refer to as the Schlepptunia. We have letters from their trip letters on the boat. They went through Italy, they stopped in Naples, they stopped in Greece. They eventually made it to Palestine, and there they moved to Schenken Street in Tel Aviv. They lived with David Tidhar. David Tidhar was a friend of my grandfather, so they moved into the Tidhar's house as they got settled. And we have letters of them in Israel in 1949, traveling to the Galil, traveling to Tzfat, traveling to Kfar Darom to check it out, and the letters are pretty depressing. The letters, my father, although he was very Zionist, he only had a degree in biblical literature from Brown. He didn't have real sort of practical skills that were needed in 1949. Everybody was saying to him, go back to the United States and get a degree in engineering and come back. The lifestyle was very difficult, the food rationing, all that sort of stuff. My father really wasn't used to that because he had grown up on Central Park West. It was a challenge. My father was a reader and he loved to read, and they used to have blackouts at night because they were afraid of Egyptian Air Force bombing, and he would refuse to turn off the lights because he was reading a book, and the police came and arrested him at some point for that. It was sort of not a good situation. Anyway, they were there for a few months. They were planning on moving to Kfar Darom, and a few months after they arrived, my mom contracted polio. At the time, there was a polio epidemic in Tel Aviv. I've spoken to an epidemiologist at Tel Aviv University about this. My mom always claimed she got it from a mikveh. I don't know if that's true or not. So they stayed for a few months, and unfortunately then they came back to the United States. My father came back by boat. My mother flew back in 1950. My grandfather paid for him to fly back. She came back. She eventually sort of fully recovered, but unfortunately that was, for the short term, the end of their Aliyah plans. In the 1950s, my father then studied engineering to try to get back to Israel. Well, that's a separate story.
1 second.
Sorry.
So they never made it to Kfar Darom?
They went to Kfar Darom to visit. They never lived in Kfar Darom. When my parents died, there were people from Kfar Darom who came to the funeral who knew them from the Shomer, but they never actually lived on Kfar Darom.
Many of these names are familiar to you? Kanofsky?
Yes,
Kanofsky?
absolutely. Aryeh Kanofsky was a good friend of my parents. Right. He became a professor of economics at Bar Ilan. He was an expert in oil economics. Yes, definitely.
Herky? Zvi Hershkovitz?
Yes, I think I know the name. Not as well as Aryeh Kanofsky, Elia Kanai. I mean, there were a lot of these. In fact, there were lots of names that people sort of, yes, that's the name.
It's Jaffe?
Yes, it's Jaffe, I know, yes. Yes, absolutely.
And that was from the Hachshara or from?
From Hachshara, from Shomer.
Yeah.
Shomer, yes, absolutely. And there were also other people in my parents' life that were sort of interesting Zionists. So my mom grew up in Kiel. I should have brought the picture with me. My mom grew up in Kiel, and one of her childhood friends, there's a picture of her at the train station with her rabbi moving to Palestine in the 1930s, was a fellow named Little Georgie Bumbach, who grew up to become Yaakov Ha'etzny. So there were all these sort of different people who sort of came through their lives at various points in time.
The Tithars.
Yes, the Tithars.
So their son was probably the same age as your father.
Yossi Tithar?
Betzalel?
Betzalel Tithar, yeah. I've never met him, but I know about him, yes. They talked about him.
We interviewed him.
Oh, okay, that's amazing.
It was a long interview with him.
Yeah. So they lived, my parents, my grandfather was friendly with the Tithars, so they lived in the Tithars' house, but they never really made it far beyond the Tithars' house because my mom got sick, and that was sort of the end of the story, for at least in the short term.
Okay. All right, so then they go back to the States.
They go back to the States. My dad studies engineering. They talk about making Aliyah. They never really get a chance. When my grandfather dies in 1972, my dad takes the inheritance from his grandfather, and he buys an apartment in Talpiot on Rehov Beitar by the Agnon Shul, and they start traveling back and forth between Israel and the States, spending months there, months in Israel, whatever, back and forth. But my dad retires from work in 1987, and 6 months after he's retired, he's shot in a robbery in Far Rockaway, and he's left paralyzed, and they never get their chance to make Aliyah, unfortunately.
They lived in New York the whole.
My parents, yeah, they moved back to the Bronx, and then in 1962 they moved to Far Rockaway, and they lived in Far Rockaway until my father was shot in 87. They lived the last few years in Muncie near my sister, and they died there. So they used to go back to Israel to visit a lot before my dad was shot, but they had tons of friends there, from the Shomer days that they stayed in touch with, but they never got a chance to make Aliyah.
Yet Jaffe was killed shot in a robbery.
Yes, I know that.
Halloween in 1978
right.
or something.
Right, and they talk a lot. My mom was friendly with some of the Lamed Hay, and she used to tell stories about, I forget which ones, because I was little, but she used to know some of them from the Shomer, and she spoke about them. Yes, and she spoke about that. She spoke about him as well. So they had these connections with people, even though their lives turned out quite different. My mom's best friends, and a lot of my mom's best friends made Aliyah sort of at the end of their lives, after their kids made Aliyah. So my mom's best friend, I think we talked about this once before, my mom's best friend growing up was Chava Friedman, who was Herschel Friedman's wife. Her son is a Rav at Gush. Mordechai. So Mordechai's mother and my mother were best friends growing up. So they all made Aliyah, in the 80s and moved to Kiryat Wolfson and all that stuff. And my parents would have done that if they hadn't.
And the apartment on Rehov Beitar?
Sad story. So it's Shavasrei Ala Rehov Beitar. After my dad was shot, my mom wanted nothing to do with it, and she offered it to her 3 children. My oldest sister was living in Minneapolis at the time, and her husband is a food chemist, and they didn't plan on going. My middle sister, the sister who's older than me, she's married to an Israeli, Yored, whose parents had an apartment in Israel anyway. Some of their children live in Israel now, and they didn't need it. I wasn't married yet. I didn't really know what the future was going to bring, so they sold it to the person who owned the apartment next to him. You may know him, Shaul Hochstein. He's a neurologist at Hebrew U, and sold it to them, and they knocked the wall down and made a giant apartment. So it's not ours anymore. I should point out also that we also don't own the apartment on 271 Central Park West, which was recently resold for $14 million. But that's a whole separate issue. That's also a sad story. Anyway.
We lived on, when we made Aliyah, my in-laws live on Rehov Kfar Etzion.
Sure, yeah, right around the corner, yeah.
And so they weren't living in Israel yet. They had just bought this apartment, right. And that's where we lived when we met Aliyah.
Oh, that's nice. That was nice. In those days, you still had a view of Herodian and things like that before they started building more buildings. And I love the rabbi there. He's a great guy at Agnon. He's a wonderful man. Anyway, so that's the story. So I mean, at the end of the day, I taught for a while at Bar Ilan, but after my dad was shot, I had to come back to sort of help care for him.
When were you in Israel?
So I was in Israel in the early 90s, but my dad was deteriorating at the time. He'd been shot already, and he was deteriorating, and my mom sort of insisted that we come back, which was unfortunate, but kibbut av v'aim, we came back, and so the end of the story is, there's not much of a story here, but the end of the story is that my grandfather at least has 2 great-grandchildren and 4 great-great-grandchildren that do live in Israel. So we have a foothold there. So my middle sister, I'm the youngest. My second sister, Sarah, has a son named Rafi Levy, who's married to a woman named Dy.C. Siegel. I don't know if you know the Siegels from Yerushalayim. Anyway, so they live in Givat Shmuel. They have 3 kids. He works at Goldman Sachs. She works at Sotheby's. And then I have a cousin, who's not named Michael Newman, who has a daughter named Tamar Newman, who married an Israeli named Amir Golan, and they live in Tel Aviv, and they have 1 child. So that's 4 great-great-grandchildren, 4 great-great-grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren live there. So hopefully more will come, but that's there now. Do you want me to show you some of the pictures here?
Anything else on your list that we didn't cover?
I think that basically covers it. Yeah, I think that really covers it. Yeah, I can show you some of the pictures if you want to see them. Just interesting.
That was amazing. That was phenomenal.
I don't know if it was phenomenal, but okay.
For me, it was fascinating.
So this is not directly related to Zionism, but it's an interesting picture. So in 1924 and 1930, when my grandfather was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco, he used to have a summer home in Palo Alto, because it's warmer in Palo Alto than it is in San Francisco. So you go there to get warmed up. And his next door neighbor was Herbert Hoover. And this is a picture of Herbert Hoover right here in July 26, 1928, getting on the train to go to Chicago to accept the Republican nomination for president. And this is my father standing in front of him. It's an unusual picture. It's not really a Zionist picture, but it's an unusual picture. Just to show you a picture, this picture I showed you already, right? So here's a picture later in life in the 1960s, just to get a sense of my great-grandfather. This is a picture of my grandfather, Louis I. Newman. This is his official Rosh Shalom portrait, when he was the rabbi of Rosh Shalom. I have some pictures. This was him growing up in Providence. This is my great-grandfather, Paul Newman. That's my great aunt Anna, and that's Louis I. Newman growing up in Providence, Rhode Island. I have some pictures here which might be of more interest to you. These are pictures that were taken in both Hakshara and in Israel when my parents made Aliyah. So these are pictures of the boat my parents took to Israel in 1949, and this is pictures when they first arrived in Israel. Here are some pictures of my parents in Tel Aviv in 1949, and I'm guessing this is a picture in 1942 in Yerushalayim. It looks like it to me. Is it? I can't tell.
It looks like...
Maybe it's not. I don't know.
It looked like the building next to it, actually. It
Okay.
looks like the building that the Mizrahi is...
Maybe. Okay, and here are some pictures in a wedding picture of my parents, and this is the Hakshara, the kibbutz in New Jersey. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a mazel tov there when they got married and people dancing when they got married. And this is my parents and my grandparents together before, at the dock before they left for Israel in 1949. And here are some pictures of my parents in Israel, and more pictures of my parents in Israel in 1949 when they got there. Trying to think what else I have here. This is just a family picture. I don't know if this interests you, but this was this was at the height of his power. This is my grandfather and my grandmother and the three sons. My dad's the one in the middle. And this is a picture of my dad and his two brothers growing up in New York. I showed you this right. This is actually an interesting side note, which is totally irrelevant to your story, but it's an interesting side note. My grandmother went to Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, and in the early 1900s, this is 1919, she wrote a letter to Stephen Wise saying that she wanted to be a rabbi. And Stephen Wise writes back saying, there's no reason why you shouldn't be a rabbi, let's talk to your parents about it. And this has become a very famous letter that scholars who want to study women in the rabbinate refer to as the first modern example of the Reform rabbinate considering women for rabbinate. She became a rebbitzin instead. Showed you that already. So this is just another family picture. I don't know, it's a nice picture, I like it, that's why I brought it in. So my grandfather, when he was at Rod of Shalom, used to summer in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And he used to they had a house in Woods Hole they would rent, and then there was a separate guest house where he would write. That's where he wrote many of his 27 books. And they used to go in the morning to the post office to pick up the mail. And this is just a picture of my grandfather carrying the mail back that morning in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and that's my father. I can't see the picture here. That's my father, my Uncle Jonathan, who became a Supreme Court Justice in Oregon, and my Uncle Dan, who was an artist. I have one last picture here, just showing my mom's side of the family, show you a difference. This is my mom's family in Kiel in Germany in the 1930s. This is my grandparents, my grandfather, and my grandmother, and this is my mother and her brother. I can go through everybody in the family, it's not important, but most of them were killed in the Holocaust and didn't get out in 1938 like my mom did. That's pretty much it.
That was fantastic.
Was it really? I don't know. I feel like I wasn't able to answer a lot of your questions.
Well, no, but when anytime we've done second generation interviews,
yeah,
you can only answer what you know.
Right.
You can't press somebody
right.
and bring them back and then try and remember.
Right.
That's the limitation of the second generation interviews,
right.
and I know that for a lot of the interviewers in the project, it is a frustration that they have.
Right.
On the other hand, this is the only way.
Right.
Otherwise, there's no it happens to be that your grandfather's story, because of the documentation at HUC and because
right.
of his prominence, etc.,
yeah.
is fairly well documented.
Right.
But a lot of the stories,
right.
there's no documentation unless
right.
you hear from a family member. So
right. So I have to go. So my niece is actually my cousin's daughter is actually doing a PhD in Jewish history at Penn, and she's very interested in this time period, and she's been to HUC to see the archives. I mean, all the papers that are in the archives were actually papers that we had in the family that my father turned over to HUC when my grandfather died. The problem is that he did that when I was 11 years old, so I haven't ever seen them. I know there are vast amounts of documents there, and I've seen a listing of some of them, but I've never actually gone through them myself. And only one person has ever written their PhD dissertation on my grandfather. There's been a number of people who come to me and say they want to write books about him. So far, nobody's done. I mean, Rafi Medoff writes a bit about him, but there's only one complete dissertation on my grandfather at this point.